Well, my name's Dick Clark. Right now I'm at the University of Southern California, where I'm a professor of educational psychology and technology, and a clinical professor of surgery at this point. My ed psych appointments in education, my surgery appointments in the med school, but it's mostly for surgical education. I also co-direct a center called the Center for Cognitive Technology. And what the center does now basically is we take on challenges from other research centers and think tanks and some corporations to try to answer questions. So one of my real interests now is in what evidence is there out there that would help answer a question, often questions that have to do about what makes a difference, what could we do to achieve a certain goal, what's the weight of the research evidence, pro and con, either in favor of or against certain strategies or methods for accomplishing goals. And so we call it cognitive technology because obviously our interest primarily is in expertise and cognition and what it is that impacts that for learning and performance and so on.
Great.
I also actually, like a lot of people in our field, I think I work with a lot of organizations. I work with companies, I work with governments, I work with the military. And in all those kinds of projects, I really am interested in application. I mean, as I've moved in my career, I've come to the point where I'm very interested in research, but I'm really more interested in it in terms of how can it inform practice. And once you do decide what you think is the best thing to do, how do you spend the time and effort and handle the complexities that are involved in actually implementing things and making certain that they work? So that's what fascinates me now. So that's all in conjunction with what I'm doing at the University of Southern California. So it's kind of like, what was it that got me started in this career? It's actually, nobody's ever asked me this question before, and it was an unusual circumstance. I was going to be a constitutional lawyer. I mean, I was a historian and I was an undergraduate in history and political science, fascinated with the history of the Constitution and constitutional law, and then I began to find out that very few lawyers ever practiced before the Supreme Court. And then one day I picked up a journal. I can't remember what the context was. I think it was in a course that I was taking in graduate school. And the journal was called AVCR, Audio Visual Communication Review, which was the precursor of the AECT journals at this point. I think ECTJ used to be called AVCR. And the article that I read was a study by a couple of people on the use of color versus black and white to teach people how to uncode transistors. At that point, transistors, electrical transistors, were coded in different colors. And the study it was conducted, it was in the military, I think it was conducted, indicated that it did not matter if you use color to teach color coding interpretation of transistors. And I said, that can't be. If it's a color task, if people have to be able to recognize the colors, and if the colors are indicating the codes that you have to know about, then color must make a difference. These guys must be wrong. So I'm going to go figure out what's going on here. And I really, I don't know why it so intrigued me and fascinated me, but I really spent a lot of time, and I actually found out that they were right. I mean, I replicated the study, I did a whole lot of things. And then I was hooked. I mean, frankly, from that day forward. And by the way, before that, I had been a television director. I'd been a film director. I actually taught courses in the history of the cinema and so on. And even though I was thinking about going into law as a profession, I dropped out of school for a while between degrees and had spent some time in the entertainment industry. And I think that probably was the fascination. I was starting to get hooked by media at that point, and I think that drove me to be interested in that question, and then that pushed me over that, and finding out that constitutional law was probably not something that was going to be available. That pushed me over the edge to do this, and really I've never looked back. I think it was a great decision. If I had to think about how I have changed in what my interests are over time, I see it as kind of a steady growth. I mean, I see it as an evolution, not huge gaps or changes necessarily. I think that once I decided that I was interested in research, I never looked back. But that didn't happen until my doctoral program. I was at Indiana University. It was a great time to be there. I think it was the largest program in the country. It was an extraordinary situation. We had the advantage of having a lot of people from other universities who were really well known would come in. Indiana at the time had a fellowship program for doctoral students that I was lucky enough to get into. And it allowed us to have classes of 5 or 6 people. It allowed us to bring in faculty from other universities as instructors. So we had people from Stanford, we had people from Harvard, we had people from Yale, we had people from Oxford, we had people from great places that came in. And it was a very exciting context to be a student. And what happened to me there is that I really bought into research. I mean, I had been a skeptic beforehand. I really thought it was a lot of nonsense. I thought of myself as an artist and a historian and so on and so forth. And I began to realize how powerful research was. And that led me then to begin to think about how would I make a difference in research, and how would I make a difference by, let's say, being a consumer of research. I've never been inclined to be an experimentalist. It actually, I'm sorry, it bores the hell out of me. And yet I'm so glad there are people that are excited by it. And I love to generate hypotheses. I love to look at data once it's available to analyze. Whatever happens between the hypothesis and the data makes me want to go to sleep. So I ended up spending a lot of time actually reading other people's research. So it's kind of a vampirish kind of inclination that I have. All right, so I decided very early that since I had this background in media and I'd gotten fascinated by that color versus black and white study, maybe I ought to go out and take a look at the media research and see what was perking there. So my first effort, really significant effort, was to go and read all the media research that I could. I still think I'm doing the same thing. I just have changed the questions that I'm trying to answer now. And I actually, while I think I've gone a lot of different directions and explored a lot of questions in my life, I think the way I'm going about it has not changed. I hope I've gotten better at it. I hope I've gotten, let's say, more, not just more skilled, but more insightful about doing it. I'm not sure that's true. But I do know that I think the evolution is more in terms of increasing skill rather than a change of direction. Is that fair? I mean, I can talk about the way I think it changed and about what I think were the big problems that I've tried to solve. But basically, if you ask how is what I was doing different than how I'm doing now, I think I'm just doing more of it. Well, there really have been some changes. I really started out in this area about I would say 65, I think, was the first time I had a job in university teaching. That's a lot of years ago. And at that time, I think, if anybody actually was interested in research, you were a radical. You were an odd, sort of quirky, dorky kind of person. That's number one. And number two, at that time, behaviorism, one of the isms, one of the dogmas, was in charge. And I was not interested that much in behaviorism, although I deeply respected it then and now. I was always interested in cognition, you know, what happens in people's minds and how would you know about that, understanding it's difficult to measure and so on and so forth. And so my take was that that I wanted very much to try to understand how learning occurred. And that was, I think, at the root of all of the questions that I was asking myself. But when I set out to do the work on media, the question I asked was, what media are going to make more difference for learning than others? Or what kind of learning is facilitated by which medium? And what kind of people work better with which kind of media for which kinds of learning outcomes? So that was really the first question that really intrigued me. Yeah, sure. I think the ideas that have sort of intrigued me and generated a lot of growth, I think first of all it was finding out that that one of the huge benefits of research was that I had the opportunity to find out I was wrong. And actually, for my whole life, I think that's been one of the most important insights for me, is that my instincts are not always correct, and sometimes are just almost fatally wrong. It's made me feel more open to the idea that it's not about being right. It's not about being instinctively right. It's like trying to find the best solution for something. Whatever works best is what it's about. And not having your guesses about what works best confirmed. And research actually does pull you up short all the time in that regard, because you always start out with a guess. And in all the researchers I've ever known in my life, very few of them have had the capability to actually make a totally accurate prediction about what was going to happen in an experiment. It never comes out the way that you expected it was going to. So there's always this opportunity to learn something. So that's number one for me, is sort of an intellectual self-correction process that you go through, which is one of the ways that I see research. The second thing is that I have a sense that there's a possibility out there in research to actually get huge and important insights. I think if you are willing to keep an open mind and to tolerate a lot of uncertainty and to continue to take in information in a kind of systematic way by, for example, reading study after study after study in a similar family of questions, this sort of intellectual pattern matching that we do almost automatically, what happens is a click happens one day. You read a whole lot of stuff, and all of a sudden, boom, it starts to fall into place, and you begin to see that there's a pattern here. Now, that pattern may just at that point be a hypothesis, but it's often an insight that's worth pursuing. And I've had that happen a number of times, and I think I could count them on one hand, but they were some of the most joyful experiences I ever had. So that insight thing, not only being corrected and being self-corrected and having the opportunity to find out what works, but also secondarily, I think, for me to see patterns. And a third area that I think's been important to me is ways to think. For example, for about 15 years, I spent my first 5 years after my doctorate at Stanford. I was on the faculty there. I had this great opportunity to work with some really bright people. Lee Cronbach, who was one of Terman's whiz kids, a brilliant guy, who, by the way, is probably the only person I ever met who, when he made a prediction about what was going to happen in an experiment, it almost always happened that way. He was an extraordinary person. And Pat Suppies and a few other really, really bright people who nobody remembers their name, I suppose, at this point, although Cronbach is probably somebody almost everybody knows. And then to work with those people day after day and to sort of see how they thought and how their minds worked. And one thing I picked up there was something called aptitude-treatment interaction, where there was this whole history we went through in the 60s, 70s, and into the early 80s, where we were looking for ways to match people with instructional treatments that were best for them. I think we're still trying to do that, but I think actually that sort of died out in any kind of systematic way, but it really encouraged me to go beyond thinking about things like technology or instructional strategies and begin to think about people and cognition and how our learning mechanisms interact with the environments we're in and so on and so forth. After a long while, I think I decided this aptitude treatment interaction stuff doesn't work for a variety of reasons. And that was another insight, but that came after only a very long time. We could talk about why not, but finding out that it didn't work was almost as important to me as finding out that it was there and it might work. So whether something works or not is not, to me, important in terms of an insight. It's finding out something where you have pretty good evidence and you can try to feel confident that you can go forward with it until you find better evidence that it either doesn't work or something else works better. What else? I think maybe one other thing, and that is something that I got challenged for after I published an article on media and its impact on learning. Probably the one that I'm known best for after all the years, God help me, because it's actually a curse professionally to be known for saying something doesn't work. But I got an email from a guy named Bob Hynek, who was a big leader in the field back in the 60s and 70s. He had been the editor of one of the, I think it was McLuhan or something, came to Indiana, was a professor there. And after I published that piece in 1983, where I made the argument that media don't cause learning, that it's probably something called an instructional method or strategies or whatever you want to call it, Bob wrote me a nice acknowledgement letter and said, you know, that's really nice insight, and I think actually people are going to gradually come around to it because the evidence looks pretty compelling. But he said, you know, Dick, you basically have talked about what doesn't work, and I have a challenge for you, and the challenge is what does work. And it was like a welcome slap in the face. You know, I thought, you know, he's right. Okay, you know, one of the problems I think is that research is actually pretty eloquent about what doesn't work, and it's not so able to give you as much information about what does work, given the plethora of things that can influence a situation. So I then actually made a 180 from looking at that question of what doesn't work and began to spend my career on what does. Not that I'm backed off completely from coming to the conclusion that something doesn't work. There's a huge number of myths in this field of education that are embarrassing, actually. One of those myths is learning styles. You know, 4 meta-analysis and how many reviews in the last decade that indicate, all of them, that it doesn't work at all. And yet it's probably taught in most every graduate school in the country as if it's gospel. I'll mention a few others. They're all controversial, but things like constructivism, I don't think that works, actually. I shouldn't use the ism, but you know, asking people to construct something to learn it is not effective or efficient way for people to learn things. So it's important to sort of point out that things that people think works don't. But I think you really have I'm now taking on the responsibility personally to then say, okay, what does work? What does make a difference? And that's not as easy, I think. And it's not as easy because it's harder to provide evidence for that. It's not as easy because you're swimming upstream against people's beliefs. People change their beliefs very slowly and tortuously, and some people think not at all, you know, very, very seldom, I think. Matter of fact, I just wrote a chapter on change as a tribute to my advisor during my graduate program when he retired. I was an advisee, Gabby Solomon at Indiana. And when Solomon retired, he was working he was trying to make peace in the Middle East. He was running a big peace center in the Middle East. So we did a book on change. So I was challenged to go out and take a look to see what's the literature on personal change? What's the best way for people to try to change? Change individuals, change groups, change societies, and so on and so on. And I came away about as depressed as I'd ever been from that review. I really think it's very difficult to change. And so now that's one of the things I'm really curious about is how do we change conceptually? How do we change ideas? How do we open ourselves more flexibly to ideas and to try to deal with data and evidence and weigh things rather than constantly look for confirmation? So it kind of ties me back full circle to where I started with this research thing, which was, I think the great advantage of it is that it lets us know when we have misperceived what might be real. It's a self-correction, it's sort of an intellectual correction device, and one that you hope operates not just on an individual level, but on a cultural level. You know, there's so many people, it's hard to choose, but I would start out to say probably Gabby Solomon, my chair, had a huge impact on me. Gabby's a brilliant guy. He's one of these people who, just talking to him is like being in a strong wind. It's like he's a force of nature. The guy was about 3 feet tall, and he had a colonel, I think, in the Israeli military, as well as a PhD. He got his PhD at Stanford in 18 months. They didn't want to give him the degree because they figured he hadn't been there long enough and suffered enough, I think, but they finally relented. A really brilliant fellow who got curious about technology. to our benefit, I think, because a lot of what goes on in our field right now, I think, is due to him and his ideas. Seminars with him were, we would have a seminar that started at 2 o'clock and was supposed to finish at 3:30, and maybe we would go home at 7 or 8 at night. And wouldn't have gone out to eat. We wouldn't have gone out for anything, actually. So it was that kind of excitement. It was really terrific. And it was because this guy's mind really worked in ways that I think were very engaging. And he both challenged, he had strong opinions, and they were so strong you couldn't help but disagree with him. And he loved that. And so it was a constant kind of debate and dialogue about what worked and what made a difference to people. So Gabby was a huge impact. I think, secondly, when I left my graduate program and went to Stanford, I think Lee Cronbach was a big influence. Cronbach was a statistician, he was a measurement person, and I had not actually done a lot of work in measurement. And early on, I was not a person who loved math. I learned to, because I just took it on as a challenge at some point. In my doctoral program, I was doing so poorly in statistics, I had to slap myself and say, stop this, you're going to go learn statistics, and I did. And finally understood it, actually, or at least I think I did. But Cronbach was just one of those people who, he was a great teacher. He'd get to know you really fast, and then he would begin to think about what was it that you needed to be better at, that if you got better at it, it was going to serve your goals. He would point it out to you, and then he would systematically start to feed you with challenges that he knew if you're willing to take them on, you're going to improve in your expertise, whatever it was. And you know, his approach, I think, has been totally validated by everything we've learned about expertise in the last few years anyway. This work by K. Anders Ericsson, for example, on what is it that characterizes experts who make original contributions. His view is that they don't rest on their laurels. They always are asking themselves, what don't they do well that if they did better, they might be more successful. So like an actor or an actress who, there are bit players, and then there are people that take on a huge variety of roles, and it's that huge variety that makes a great actor or actress. And that was his view about, I think, that's both Ericsson's view, and I think that's basically what Lee Cronbach was about also. Now, there was also another guy there named Dick Snow, who since has died, but Snow was a psychologist, and he was very interested in this aptitude treatment interaction stuff. And he was the only person in education at Stanford at that time who was interested in technology also. And but he had this good idea. I mean, he had a good approach to it. And so he was always challenging me. He was probably the reason why I sat down and did that study that resulted in the article about that media don't make a difference to learning. They make a difference in cost or time, but not learning. And it was a constant challenge from him, I think, to think in a research sense about this that really made a difference to me early on. Since then, and that was really my graduate school years and the first few years after I got out and was in a university, I don't think I could count the number of people that have had a huge influence. And there have been many of them, and I think that if I even started to make a list, somebody that probably had equal or even greater, I forget people that had equally or greater influence. I think people have a huge influence on you when you're in school because you go there to open your mind to consider alternatives. Some people go there to have their assumptions confirmed, but if it's a good school, that doesn't happen, I think. As a matter of fact, I used to judge graduate students' success almost to the extent to which they changed their minds when they were in graduate programs. And I didn't care which direction they changed their mind. It wasn't whether I agreed with them or not. It was, if you're not changing your mind, you're not thinking enough. You're not really looking at evidence enough. Or else you're the genius of the century, and that's a bit unlikely at this point. So I think that's where you're most influenced. After that, you tend to influence yourself, and it tends to be an interaction with people, I think. And there have been many people I've interacted with. I've tried hard over the years to collaborate with people on research. So a lot of my articles are co-authored. And those co-authorships are really collaboration. They're intellectual collaborations with people. And I think I would also, I would include a lot of my students as people that had a huge influence on me. You get into these relationships with in a graduate program with students that are very intense and they're very intellectual, and they're personal relationships too, but the idea, you're constantly exchanging ideas, you're constantly challenging each other, you're constantly doing things both as individuals and in groups. And I think probably a lot of the most important insights I've had are when I've been interacting with students, particularly when I've been trying to explain something to a student or to make a point, and found a student who found a twist in it that I hadn't thought of, an insight that just blew me away and that really started me thinking somehow differently. And I think actually it's those settings and those contexts where I've learned more than anything. So I'd include almost all of the doctoral students that I've had over the years. The things that have carried through all of my research in my life, the sort of trajectory that I've been on, I think is characterized best by, first, the fact that I don't trust anything absolutely. I trust research in more than I trust a whole lot of other things. I think when bright people sit out in as fair a way as they can to test ideas, and they do that intelligently, I think the results of those are genuinely worth spending time to understand. Whether you agree with them or not is irrelevant to some extent. It's that there's some kind of absolute truth in data. I'm sorry, I don't even believe I said that, but I think I actually believe it. The problem is to interpret the data. And there's no absolute truth in the interpretation of the data. The data is what it is. It came there by all the forces that actually controlled it. And your job is to figure out how it got to be that way. And I think that's what, if there's anything that's threaded through everything I've done, I really think that's really important. That may be one of the reasons why I'm not as dedicated an experimentalist as a lot of people would be. I love experimentalists because they generate the stuff that interests me the most. I just don't love to do it. So that's A. B, the kind of questions that interest me are questions about what makes a difference. And if I had to pick one thing that I was most interested in, more than anything else, it's learning. I think we too quickly forget, particularly in instructional technology, educational technology, that what we're about is learning. We're not about technology, we're not about machines, we're not about social media, we're not about whatever the newest gimmick is that's out there. We're out what makes a difference in the learning of people at all ages, all stages, and all contexts. And we forget that way too often, especially in our enthusiasms for solutions. So one of the other things that I think has been part of my trajectory is to think always about the fact that that the temptation is to find a solution and go try to find a problem that it will solve. I'm going to full stop there just for a second, because I think to me that was a mind-bending insight when I had it. If you look at the world and if you look at our field and you ask yourself what's going on, you'll find out what's going on is that people are trying to sell solutions to other people. I use the word sell in parentheses and in quotation marks. It's not that we're out there trying to get money for them, although some people are, but it's sort of like trying to convince people that this is a solution to your problem. And we need to turn that around to what problem are we solving, be really clear about that, and then spend time thinking about what solutions might there be to that problem as you have defined it. And if you don't find solutions, go back and ask yourself whether you've actually carefully enough and accurately enough defined the problem that you're trying to solve. So that's been a significant part of the trajectory for me, is to try to be clear about the problems that I want to solve, and to be able to recognize them, to be able to measure them, to be able to know when I've solved them, before I'm arrogant enough to begin to make some assumptions about what might actually accomplish that goal. I shouldn't have to hesitate about what contributions I've made that I'm most proud of. I have actually mixed feelings about a lot of what people think are my contributions. For example, I think if that a lot of people would point to that article 1983, the grocery truck analogy, which, by the way, I took from one of my graduate students, who I've acknowledged many times since, but it's very important. Somebody was telling me yesterday they saw a bumper sticker that said, "My other car is a grocery truck." Okay. And by the way, that analogy is what people remember. A lot of people have not read the article. It's a legion, but very few people have not heard the analogy. A week after that article appeared in the journal, the president of Harvard was interviewed and used the analogy. He had read the article and used the analogy as the reason why he wasn't going to support the purchasing of computers for the faculty at Harvard. It was not a very appropriate interpretation of the article, actually. So the reason why I have misgivings about it is not because I got hate mail afterwards, and I did. I can't tell you how many letters I received that said I was taking food out of people's kids' mouths and so on and so forth with this. They're going to let me go, you know. They're going to fire me. I think it has to do with, it was a very negative event. It was what didn't work. I since have understood that in order to actually ask people to change their minds about something that they're so committed to that they're not really open to evidence about it, is to show them evidence that what they think about it is not accurate, as opposed to handing them an alternative at that point. People aren't often open to an alternative unless what they believe works, they find out doesn't work. And so I've forgiven myself for doing something really negative, and that's actually a negative event, because then it opened the door, I think, more towards the growth of instructional design. Because that's what works, in my view, or at least some form of that. While we can argue a lot about what features of instruction make a difference in learning, and there are people now that argue that instruction doesn't matter. I mean, the instructivist, constructivist thing makes me crazy, but there really are people out there in our field who say that instruction is not the solution. Maybe it's their definition of instruction, but the whole idea of challenging your assumption about what makes a difference is part of this full process of what does make a difference. So I would say I've tried to work both sides of the fence. When I get a challenge at the research center to go out and investigate a kind of an area of research to answer a question about some kind of human performance or learning or something like that, some certain type of learning or certain context, I often start out by asking, what is it people think right now? What's the commonest, what appears to be the most common assumption about what this is? Even if there's a variety of points of view, what are they? What are the most typical? And then I began to look to see what's the evidence against those typical points of view. And often it's there, and sometimes it's there pretty obviously, and people are not looking at it. And then once I get that, then I take the next step and say, well, what appears to be the most powerful strategy that you could use in order to accomplish this goal or solve this problem that somebody who's challenged us has? And our take is, and I say our because there's a team that I work with, of course, our take is that the combination of those two things is really essential in order to try to make a contribution. So reflecting back on my own career, I think it was the media stuff first. I still do love media, I have to say. I mean, I want that in history. I'm a media nut. I love movies. I like video games. I like everything having to do with visual media. It's just an extraordinary entertainment experience. I like having my sense of reality interrupted. I'm excited about the fact that media has developed in a way, and is going to continue to develop in a way that removes our disbelief about whether we're in an unreal situation or not. I think that's hugely exciting. And I'm tempted to go off on some tangents here about what it means to have your sense of disbelief interrupted, but I will not give in to the temptation, because to me, media is the answer to some questions, but learning is not one of those questions. Okay, so that to me was a contribution. I think the second one was, I have spent a huge number of years trying to characterize this thing that early on Lee Cronbach and Dick Snow called an instructional method. And what they meant by that was some external support. It's now called scaffolding, or I don't care what term you give it, but some external support for a necessary cognitive process that is required for somebody to learn something. And this external support only can or should happen when people can't or won't do it for themselves. Now that statement is something we've known easily since the 60s, and there are people that claim there were people in the 1920s that were saying these things. Nobody pays attention, I'm sorry to say, but it really has been there for quite a while. And in my view, I've tried hard to, for example, to get people to be really clear about what they mean by any treatment that they think influences learning, and why. What's their explanation for why that particular treatment, that particular intervention, method, call it whatever you wish, should actually have an influence on learning, should have led to whatever variance you noticed in the outcome of a learning study. And to try to talk journal editors into forcing people that submit articles to actually be clear about what their treatments are. I mean, half the journal articles I read, more than half, 3/4 of the journal articles I read, I have no idea what the intervention was. I mean, I understand what a person says it was. Pick almost anything. People advocate today things like problem-based learning. Well, it's a great idea, problem-based learning. The problem is there's like 50 different definitions of what, or operational definitions, exactly what problem-based learning is. And that includes people whose definition was at one point 3 or 4 years ago, but it's changed now, but they're still calling it by the same name. How do you have a dialogue when you can't define the terms that you're having a dialogue about? Serious games. There's this fascination with electronic games because kids and adults are intrigued by them, so let's use them for education. Nobody has yet defined, operationally defined, what a learning game is, what a serious game is. The military had a big conference on this a few years ago, just 2 years ago now, and they brought in a lot of top people and names that everybody would recognize in games and educational research, and said, we want you to do 2 things. We want you to define what they call it a serious game is, and secondly, we want to tell you, we want you to sort of try to agree on what are the elements of an effective learning game or serious game. After 2 days, this group had not agreed on the definition of a game. And I think that fairly characterizes the whole field of instructional technology, and even, I'd go even further, to educational research. We hide from the challenge to be operationally clear about what we're doing, because the moment we do that, we open ourselves to criticism. And we allow each other to do that so that nobody comes after us to some extent. I mean, there has to be part of the motivation here is to, we build this big tent, we allow people to come in with a whole lot of ideas, which is absolutely terrific, but we also allow them not to be clear about what it is that they're doing. And that to me is something that I've been very much against and really have tried to change. I don't think we can advance until we challenge each other to be precise, as precise about treatments as we are about the way we measure learning. We have this tradition of being concerned about reliability and different kinds of validity in our dependent measures in research. We have no tradition about being as clear and as operational and as precise about the treatments that we develop. And that makes it almost impossible to interpret the results of educational research. So who's being served by that, I ask myself. My guess is if this video is being viewed 20 years from now, it's going to still be a problem. Unless something drastic happens, it's going to still be a problem. To me, there's the biggest problem right now in the entire field of education. It permits us to have a huge variety of things going on there, but it also makes us totally ignorant practically of what it is that's making a difference in different contexts. Well, I think the thing I probably enjoyed more than anything in my career I haven't even spoken about yet except tangentially. I think the thing I enjoyed most was working with students. I think pretty much everything I learned that was important to me, I either learned as a student working with other students and faculty, or as a professor working with students. I always thought people ought to ask me to pay to do it. I'm serious. I would have done it for nothing. Couldn't afford to. I wasn't independently wealthy, so I had to take a salary, but it wasn't that great, frankly. And what's more exciting? I never learned as much as when I had to teach something to somebody else. It was so selfish, I thought, being in a class as an instructor, because I felt I was learning twice to 3 times as much as everybody else, and so thankful that that was the case. And a lot of that learning had to do with preparation, but most of it had to do with the interaction that came when you were testing out ideas with really bright people, particularly with graduate students who, if you encourage them in the correct way, they're encouraged to say, no, I don't agree, I have another point of view. Even if they don't, just to exercise thinking of different alternatives and thinking of other ways to pursue problems. Not to be adversarial, not to back themselves into a corner and silo themselves, but to actually consider alternative points of view, and then hopefully ensure that they're going to be increasingly flexible in their own thinking and sort of open to new ideas as they go on. So, to me, I'd rather be remembered as a teacher, but sort of a, I don't know, I can't think of a Lon Corny way to say it, sort of a collaborator in the sort of distributed cognition intellectual growth that goes on when you're in a wonderful university setting with bright people who are trying, motivated people. More importantly, people are really willing to invest effort in trying to solve a problem. I think actually the things that make anybody productive make scholars productive. I genuinely do. I don't think it matters what area you're in, although there are some specifics that are specifics to every area of expertise, but the broad strokes are, I think, you have to be, I think, clear about where you're going and what you want to accomplish. Not in a highly specific, detailed sense, but I think you need to keep in front of your mind, what do I want to be doing 10 years from now? What do I really, really, in my heart of hearts, want to be doing? And then I think the second question you have to ask yourself, and this was the most important question to me in some ways, was, what am I doing that's not helping me get there? And I think that question is critical at every stage of your life, but I think it's never more critical than when you're young and when you're in, when you're leaving graduate school and getting into your first even in graduate school for that matter, but and particularly there, because God knows there's a lot of distractions in graduate school. But if you go into a university and you're going to be in that setting, because that's the one I know the best over the years, the temptations and the pressures to get involved in all kinds of silly, ridiculous, time wasters is just huge. You have to learn how to say politely no and to find mentors that will protect you when you do that. I lived in Indonesia for a while, and I always loved the way the Indonesians don't have a word for no in their language. And I learned something from them. And their word, when you ask an Indonesian something, they'll always be polite and they'll be positive about what you said, but if they don't want to do it, they'll come back and say, could I wait? In other words, there's a word belum in Bahasa Indonesia, and it means not yet. And not yet means never. But it's the polite way to say it. So how do you find polite belum kinds of responses to, will you join the dean's committee to decide how to spend the milk money? I mean, that time burner where you get in the room, everybody's got something to say, and mostly it's a total damn waste of time. Sorry to go on and on about this, but I genuinely feel that more great academic careers have crashed on this issue of not knowing when and how to say no and not being protected by somebody if you're terribly vulnerable. Because you see, a dean's job is to get you to do all the stuff that the faculty that can say no won't, because you're not tenured yet. And your job is to reacquaint the dean with the fact that you're never going to get tenure if you do that silly crap that he or she's demanding that you do. So, okay, I won't go on and on with that, except that I generally think that that's really critical. The third thing, in my view, is to find associations with really capable people who are driven like you are to answer a certain question, but who bring to the table a different set of skills, a different kind of background, even a different discipline if it has to be, because I think that learning to think about problems from other disciplinary approaches is a huge benefit, especially as you're first getting started. And so collaborations to me are very important too. And being clear about who gets credit for what turns out to be really critical. I know a lot of people who are happy to have collaborations with bright people and who are better known, only to find out that they're doing somebody else's work and they're back being a graduate student again. Sorry to go into that, but I think that's actually a serious issue. What else makes a difference as you're going forward and trying to be successful? I think that you have to think about when you're publishing something, when you're writing something, when you're communicating with people about what you're doing, you've got to learn to be an effective communicator by asking yourself, what do I want to happen in the minds of the people that are reading or hearing and then hopefully subsequently thinking about it? What will get them to really focus on the critical thing that I'm trying to accomplish in this? Just writing it down, particularly in this stilted, stupid thing we've done in research of this. I know that, I know we have to give certain kinds of information, but this formula we've developed for a research paper is borderline absurd because it doesn't communicate except with other people who we're not trying to communicate with often in the first place. So things to me, I think some of the things I learned was finding a great metaphor or analogy for what it is that you're trying to communicate is hugely important. I mentioned that earlier in the media study, doing the grocery truck analogy is on everybody's mind. It won't be forgotten for a very long time. So that to me is a huge thing. Can you boil it all down to a bullet point? Can you boil it all down to an analogy, a metaphor, or a story of some kind? A story about a real person, but an archetypal story that represents the data, represents the point, but it brings it down to a human level. So I want people to learn how to be communicators. I think that's so critical, and I'd love to be remembered that way also, that I at least made an effort towards it. And lately, I've been challenging myself not to write for research journals or magazines. I've been challenging myself to write for general audiences, to write for the AECT, the American Federation of Teachers Journal, and places like that. And believe me, it's a challenge. And that's a challenge I think we all ought to take on.
Marshall McLuhan seems to be very much at odds with a lot of the things that you've said. What did he say that still stands? What's still left as useful from McLuhan?
I think McLuhan sort of understood more than a lot of people how important symbolism is to people, and how the things that we create in a society are not just they're not just machines and buildings and roads and so on. They're symbolic of something. And if you step back from the object itself and ask yourself, what does it symbolize, you'll get insights that you wouldn't have ordinarily. I think my argument, I have an argument with McLuhan, obviously. That's one of the people I started out to argue with, and I don't think the medium was the message. But I think he understood that most people think the medium is the message. Why? Because it's in front of your face, it's obvious, and it's a very compelling experience. But it turns out that media itself is not what happens. It's what's on the medium that makes a difference. That's what we have to be concerned about. And yet, it's mastering the mechanism of the technology that is most up in front and most obvious. What's not obvious is the hidden stuff, which is the design of what's in all those wonderful media experiences that you have. Who did that? Who wrote that script? Who developed that storyboard? What's the hidden, completely sexless kind of undergirding structure that's there, that's connected somehow with my cognition and has had this huge impact on me? That's the question we have to answer. And to me, that's why educational technology risks being obsolete, because we haven't found a way yet to communicate to people that what we have to offer is something that's always behind the scenes. It's always the structure that's controlling all this obvious, upfront, wonderful stuff that we experience. It's the difference between the adulation that we give to actors, and even secondarily to directors, and not to the screenwriters that made it all happen. We are the screenwriters of education, and we've got to find a way to get people to respect our craft and our science and our technology. And we've not succeeded at doing that or communicating about it yet. One of my real interests lately, and I think it's going to be true now for the next few years, maybe to the end of my career, has to do with automated knowledge. I think if there's any insight that I've had, it was not mine, I got it from other people, but the one that's been the most powerful for me in the last 5 to 10 years is that most of all human knowledge is automated and unconscious. That what we're actually consciously aware of is such a small, tiny portion of what we know that that we have to learn more about this automated knowledge, or what some people call implicit knowledge or expertise. There's a whole lot of names for it. What we find is that when you ask an expert how to do something, we actually call it the 70% principle now. They are not going to tell us about 70% of the mental capacity, the mental operations they have to perform in order to succeed in their area of expertise. These are operations that allow them to pattern match, to see what kind of problems they need to solve, and when they find a problem that needs solving, to know exactly what steps to take in order to solve it, what kinds of decisions need to be made, and so on and so forth. That, when they do this over and over again, it automates. I think this is John Anderson's view, it's the view of a whole lot of people out there, and yet it is not well understood generally, despite even the popular books about it lately. Blink, and so on and so on. All these popular, we're doing this now in the year, 2011, 2012, and we've just come through a number of books about advanced expertise that are popular books, because education completely rejects the idea, more or less, or at least they haven't yet understood that your job in schools, if you're going to promote learning, is to try to teach people so that they, as quickly as possible, can automate what they learn, so they don't have to think about it anymore, so their minds then are free to learn new things, because that's the purpose of our conscious mind. That's the purpose of working memory. And then I began to think about all the consequences of the fact that most of our knowledge is automated, so automated that we are not even ourselves aware of it. And one of those things is, who teaches? Experts. And we get people who know something about math, when we say, you go teach math. Well, they know math, they don't know anything about teaching. Let's be clear about that. They don't even know what they know about math, or any other field for that matter. The third thing about this automated knowledge thing that I think is critical is a whole series of insights that are available now in social psychology. And almost nobody outside of social psychology is talking about it. Yet it swept social psych, and that is that this automated knowledge is not just how to do things, it's should you do it. In other words, it's intentions, it's goals. And the view is that not only are we not in control of much of what we do, we think we are. Now that view is not just in social psych, it's validated in neuroscience. I mean, for 20-some years, we've known in neuroscience that if you ask a person, you tell a person you're going to ask them to make a decision. The decision can be something as simple as, put 2 fingers up, and in a second I want you to move one, but don't decide now which finger you're going to move. Now move it. And they will go this, and they'll say, when did you decide? Well, just now I decided to move that finger. They can see on an MRI that you decided the moment you understood what the task was. You made that decision, but you believe you didn't make it till just before you moved it. Well, that's a simple task. Somebody said, well, so why get all excited about that? It turns out that almost all decisions are the same way, and that most of the decisions we make we're not even aware of making. That's number one. Number two is that we can have very clear goals and very clear values about what we want to accomplish, and something can happen in our environment that completely changes our goals, and we are not aware of what it was. And if we do reflect on it, we believe that we changed our mind, when in fact we didn't. So there's a whole lot of literature now on something called priming. Okay? obvious but not so, or not so obvious features in our environment that when we see them, or when we more or less scan them, when we take them in a bit, have a huge impact on not only our intentions, but on what we do cognitively, this automated cognitive knowledge. These things have been out for so long. There's a guy named John Barg who had a book a few years ago about the myth of intentionality, the myth of making self-decisions. It got a huge splash and then nobody paid attention to it. And I think unless we take into account in education, particularly in instructional technology and anybody concerned with learning, that most of what controls learning is automated and unconscious, and most of what people learn is only valuable to them, or is primarily valuable, if they can turn it into an automated cognitive and motor routine that accomplishes that goal, and then do it in such a way that it can be generalizable, that it's not so tied to or specific to the context where you learned it. That is going to be the biggest challenge in the next 2 decades or 3 decades, in my view. Yeah, that's interesting. I thought about that a bit. I guess as you get older, you think about those things. But I was just a dumb kid. I mean, I grew up in a farm town, you know, a couple thousand people. Actually, was born on a farm. I went to the city soon after that, but it wasn't much of a city. The city was so poor that my first school was a 3-room schoolhouse, literally 8 years in 3 rooms. That was important to me, it turned out. I mean, I realized right away that it wasn't the first grade I was interested in. I was interested in what the 4th and 5th graders were doing. And because nobody much tracked, you could go sit and listen to what other kids were doing. And I think I did a lot of that. The second thing was that my parents were always, I think they were always willing to give us a pass on things if we read. So I probably escaped from a lot of stuff by very early getting interested in reading. So I was a good reader. And I was a first child in a big family, which is always a benefit because parents spend a lot of time with the first kid, and when the 3rd or 4th one comes along, they start to lose interest. So it's older kids that raise younger ones. So there was a benefit. Another benefit was that I had an uncle who was an artist and who would show up occasionally. And would just live with my parents for 6 months or so because, you know, some art thing he tried failed or something, or he'd been to Paris and had gotten in trouble and had to leave. You know, it was all kinds of reasons. But this guy was amazing. He was like having a tutor. I'd ask him a question and he would answer it for 3 days. And he wouldn't talk at me for 3 days. For 3 days we would explore I was very careful after a while about any question I asked him. But it was like, if you were really interested in something, he was there and he never talked down to us. He was always willing to, he was just an incredible teacher, I think. Never did much of else in his life, but he was, well, actually he did. I think he fought in the French underground during the war because he spoke English, and he got inducted into the army because he was in Paris when the Germans invaded. And that's another story by itself. But that was important to me. And then finally, when I was in high school, I came down with a genetic issue, something called ankylosing spondylitis, which was, nobody knew about it at the time, but I was in terrible pain for a while. I couldn't walk. I had to be in a wheelchair, not for very long, but it got my attention. And I had, our family doctor was a really brilliant guy, really nice guy. He was actually the brother of a philosopher, well-known philosopher at the time. He got me aside one day and said, you know, Dick, he said, I don't know what's going on with you, but I know there's something really wrong with your skeleton. I don't think it's going to kill you, but I think there's a good chance it's going to cripple you. So I got some advice for you. And the advice is, I think you ought to figure out how to live with your head, how to live on your mind, how to sort of live with your intellect and not with your hands. Otherwise, I probably would have been selling shoes at the local supermarket or something like that, you know. So I said, oh, I mean, I kind of dealt with it as, okay, that's reality, and maybe he's right. And as a result, I was the first one in my family ever go to college. And I did that because I said, you know, I think I have to. I can't go to work for General Motors. I grew up near Detroit. Everybody I knew went to work for General Motors or one of the automobile companies. I'm going to go to college and I'll work with my mind. And that was a huge benefit. I think actually you'll hear this story from a lot of people who as kids had health problems. I think that what you realize when that happens is that you've got to plan for a not that normal life, or at least if it's going to be normal, it's going to be a life of the mind and not necessarily a life where you make money because of physical labor, or you support yourself that way. So I think all those things were really important. And then, of course, having parents that were, I think, really willing to let me pretty much go my own way, that encouraged me to be independent. That was very helpful too. So that's as best I can do with early influences. I don't think any of them had anything to do with what I chose to do in specific terms, but I think they had a lot to do with my decision basically to make my life in universities. When nobody I knew at the time, I don't think, had, other than the doctor in the town and maybe a lawyer or two, had ever been to a university. My heroes were sports, they were the usual kind of kid heroes. They were not great intellectuals. So it was great. I mean, I'm really thankful for all of that. I have this lifelong fascination with antiquities. For example, one of my uncles had a farm. Every time he plowed, I would follow the plow and pick up Indian arrowheads. We lived, our farm was in an area that had been a very large Iroquois Indian encampment in Michigan. And I filled, cigar boxes with Indian arrowheads. And then got interested in Native Americans, and then from there got interested in pre-Columbian cultures. And then from there got interested in Neanderthals, and from there got interested in, all kinds of prehistory. So that actually has not just only been a lifelong hobby. I have one of the largest collections, I think, in the United States of Neanderthal hand axes. I'm really interested in Native American history and technology. I at one time convinced myself that my interest had to do with the history of technology, because stone tools are something I'm very interested in. I think they say a lot about Neanderthals, for example, who made the same tool for 500,000 years. Exactly the same tool in all over the world. What caused that? Why didn't they do it? In the moment we had Homo sapiens, the tool use just exploded into huge varieties. You look at those two facts and you can understand a great deal about the cognitive differences between Neanderthals, who were genetic alternatives to Homo sapiens, and what the difference was between the two. I actually think Neanderthals had great procedural knowledge. I think they learned well how to do the same thing and how to repeat it. But I don't think they were very creative. I don't think they had good declarative processes, conscious, sort of principle-based, process-based knowledge that allowed them to imagine things different than the way they were. So that in that sense, there's a connection to what I've done professionally. But it's not that intrigues me, basically. I feel some kind of a kinship with the past. When I went to Colombia, South America in the 70s with the Ford Foundation, and I got to know a bunch of archaeologists. They were interesting people. I used to go out on digs with them because they knew I knew a bit. I'd read a lot before I left. And being on one of those digs and watching them uncover stuff that hadn't come to light in thousands of years, that made the hair in the back of my neck stand up. That was really terrific. So it's sort of for me, it's a sense of being in touch with history. If I hadn't done what I'd done, I probably would be a dealer. Slap me, but I'd be trying to make a living at it by I actually, in a couple of sabbaticals, in order to make up my salary while I was doing research, I would put together collections of stone tools or arrowheads or different kinds of things from a certain culture and location, and then I would sell them to people that I would do all of the research on it. I would write a description of what everything was and the provenance of everything, and then I would sell it to collectors. And I actually often made a lot more than my salary doing that. So I obviously had the choice of doing it full time and making money at it, and I chose not to because it wasn't what I was most interested in. But that's I think probably that more than anything has been my hobby. Other than the fact that I'm just a nut about movies and TV, and I'll go to any and all movies. I think of Netflix. If I didn't have Netflix, I don't know what I would do, for example. So those two things are probably the things that have most engaged me outside of my family, my wife, and and kids and my profession. While I do agree totally that because of the internet and a whole lot of things, what you have available, what you can get access to quickly is amazing, the volume of it. I would like to be convinced, however, that that has led people to be more open to a variety of ideas and sources and content. I think the reverse has happened.
Yeah.
I don't know why. Let me tell you why. Just crazy things like libraries used to have open stacks. Today we don't even think library. We don't need libraries anymore. We've got the internet. And by the way, that's fine. I don't have any romantic notion about libraries, but I know that when I went into a library, what I learned almost never, the most important thing I learned almost never had to do with what I was going there for. It had to do with, oh, I've never seen that. Open it up, look through it. Oh, there's something. We don't read newspapers anymore. Well, when you read a newspaper, you don't say, I'm only interested in a story on X, Y, or Z. You turn the pages. And as you turn the pages, something catches your eye and you read it. It wasn't because you initially intended to. It's because there you happened on the idea. I don't see easily the possibility of that in the media because a lot of people are turning to the internet for news, and they only want news in certain areas and they ignore news in other areas. And I think that's dangerous. I think it silos us. I think it makes us narrow. I think that we lose our kind of overall grasp of things. And I think if there's anything going on now in this country right now, it's this siloing of points of view, of narrow points. Look what's happened to education. Hundreds of different journals. Well, it's great we got a lot of journals. Is it? No, thank you, because what happens is journals now define little small groups who only communicate with each other. There's a journal now that just deals with a certain approach to online screen design. I will not name the journal. And the people who are publishing in that journal and who do that research have no idea what anybody outside of that little narrow group is doing. This is what they call siloing, and maybe it's a reaction to having too much information available. I don't think so. I just think we're permitting people to be narrow and shallow and so on, and not think that history is important, which it always is. So I would like to see us work harder at advising people what the best way to approach all of this richness that's available to them. Like design, like this field that a lot of us are in, you call instructional design, it's the plan that you make, it's the sequence that you go through that's more important than the technology that you have available or even the ideas. If you don't plan to be open-minded, if you don't plan to look at a lot of different alternatives, if you don't plan to be interdisciplinary in the way that you approach a problem, you deserve the narrow, siloed, shallow conclusion that you reach. On an individual basis, that's damaging, but on a social basis, it's destructive. And that's my big concern. That and the fact that, okay, I'm going to get on a soapbox at least just once, that we have this society that is based on adversarial interactions. Our legal system forces us all to take these contrary points of view and then let the system decide which is correct, as opposed to what's going on here? What's the evidence about all this? Can we decide what the strategy is and do that without putting ourselves in two totally opposing camps, which neither one obviously are ever completely the case. It's all part of this thing. So we've done great at making a lot of information available instantly and economically available. I am overwhelmed with it. I think it's absolutely terrific. But we have not done great in preparing ourselves for how to do it in such a way that we get benefit from it as opposed to the people that are selling it to us.